A hiss in the night, a deadly secret creeping silently. The case of the spotted gan awaits Holmes. Welcome to Revenge Oath. Write in the comments where you are listening from. Your thoughts make every story more alive. Now, let's begin. In the early spring of 1888, a most singular case was brought before my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the details of which have remained impressed upon my mind as one of the most curious examples of his remarkable powers. The matter began, as so many did, within the familiar confines of Baker Street, where the morning sunlight filtered weakly through the smog of London, glinting off Holmes's chemical apparatus and the untidy stacks of newspapers that lay in perpetual disarray about our sitting-room. Holmes was engaged at his violin, coaxing from it a tune that was equal parts mournful and analytical, when a sharp rap sounded upon the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young woman whose pallor and trembling hands betrayed her agitation before a word had passed her lips. She was plainly but respectably dressed, her cloak travel-stained, and her wide, frightened eyes flitted about the room before settling upon Holmes with a mixture of desperation and relief. "You have come at a fortunate hour, madam," Holmes said, setting aside his violin. "Pray, be seated. You are in some distress, and time, I judge, is of the utmost consequence." The woman clasped her hands tightly in her lap as she spoke in a hurried, breathless fashion. "Mr. Holmes, my name is Helen Stoner. I live at Stoke Moran with my stepfather, Dr. Grimesby Roylott of Surrey. My sister Julia. She died 2 years ago in the most dreadful circumstances, and now I fear I am in grave danger myself." I could not help but lean forward, struck at once by the intensity of her words. Holmes, however, regarded her with that calm, searching gaze that so often unsettled the nervous. "You say your sister died under unusual conditions," he said, "and now you feel her fate threatens you as well. Tell us everything, Miss Stoner, with as much precision as you can command." Her voice faltered, but she steadied herself. 2 years passed, and Julia was to be married. On the night before her wedding she spoke of strange noises in her chamber, a low whistle in the dead of night. She came to me, pale and frightened, but we could not discern its cause. Later I heard her scream. I rushed to her room and found her at the doorway, gasping her final words. "It was the band! The Speckled band!" She collapsed and died in my arms, Mr. Holmes. No mark of violence was found, and the doctors could not say how she perished. Holmes's eyes gleamed, though his expression remained grave. "A band, you say?" A curious last utterance. "Yes," she whispered. "And now, Mr. Holmes, I too am to be married. But scarcely a week ago, repairs forced me to move into Julia's old chamber, and last night I heard it myself, the same whistle, faint and chilling in the darkness. I scarcely dared to breathe. I beg you, sir, save me from my sister's fate." For a long moment Holmes was silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The firelight caught his sharp features, lending him the air of a hawk about to strike. At last he spoke. "Your case, Miss Stoner, presents features of the most extraordinary interest. Watson, we must lose no time. There are questions to be asked, and answers, I think, to be wrung from Stoke Moran itself. For now," he rose abruptly, "you will kindly allow me to make my own inquiries before this day is over. Your life, it would appear, hangs upon them. I saw relief mingled with dread in the poor lady's eyes, and though I did not yet grasp the full peril, I knew from Holmes's manner that the game was indeed afoot." Holmes motioned for Miss Stoner to draw nearer to the fire, for she shivered despite the warmth of the grate. I could see the exhaustion about her face, the faint bluish shadows beneath her eyes, and I wondered whether fear or sleeplessness had most to do with her pallor. Holmes, ever sparing with courtesies yet unfailingly considerate in his own manner, handed her a cup of water before resuming his position upon the hearthrug. "Now, Miss Stoner," said he, "to aid us, we must first anchor ourselves in facts. The greater the detail, the closer we draw to truth. Let us begin with your household. You say you live with your stepfather, Dr. Roylott. Describe him to me." Her hands tightened upon her cloak. "Dr. Grimesby Roylott is the last of a once noble family of Surrey. He lived for many years in India as a physician. There he married my mother, a widow, and brought her and her 2 daughters back to England. But my mother died but a few years after our return, leaving Julia and me to his guardianship." She hesitated, her voice lowering. "He is a man of violent temper, Mr. Holmes. All the countryside knows of it. He once beat his native butler nearly to death, and has been fined for assault. He keeps strange company, gypsies who camp upon our land, and wild creatures from India that roam about the grounds. A cheetah and a baboon, to name only 2." Holmes gave a slight nod, his eyes half closed. "A curious household indeed. And financially?" "Ruined," she said with bitterness. "The estate has declined. The house is crumbling. The rooms are scarcely habitable. My stepfather lives in but a few chambers, and Julia and I in others. His income, what remains of it, is controlled by our late mother's will, which leaves each daughter a portion upon marriage." Holmes opened his eyes and fixed her sharply. "So if you were to wed, a certain sum would pass from his hand into yours?" "Yes, sir," she said, her face paling further. "Most enlightening," Holmes murmured. "Now tell me more about your sister's death." Every circumstance, however trivial, Miss Stoner gathered herself. "Julia slept in the chamber next to my own. The night she died, a storm rattled the shutters. She came to me, saying she had heard a low whistle in the darkness, the same she had noticed for several nights. She was frightened, but we could think of no cause. Later, I woke to her cry. She staggered into the corridor, her face contorted with agony, her hands clawing at her throat. Her words were, 'The Speckled band,'" Holmes supplied softly. She nodded, trembling. "Yes. Then she fell dead before my eyes. The doctors examined her, but could find no sign of poison or violence. My stepfather insisted she had died of fright or some nervous shock, and no further clue. None, save that faint whistle. I told the coroner, but he dismissed it as imagination." Holmes tapped his long fingers together. "You mentioned gypsies upon the grounds. Were they present then?" "Yes, and still are. They often wear gaudy handkerchiefs spotted with colours, so that when Julia spoke of a speckled band, your mind leapt to them," Holmes concluded, a tempting but perhaps too obvious connection. He paced the room, his dressing gown flaring behind him. "Now, as to last night, you heard this whistle yourself?" "I did. It was faint, yet distinct. I had scarcely blown out my candle when it came, low and clear, followed by silence. I did not sleep again." Holmes stopped abruptly. "Your room, what is its relation to Dr. Roylott's?" "It is the one adjoining his, separated only by a narrow passage. On one side lies Julia's chamber, now mine, and on the other, his own. Each has a door opening into the corridor, but there are no communicating doors." Holmes turned swiftly toward me. "Watson, do you observe? A whistle, heard in succession by both sisters, always in that room, never elsewhere. There is a method here." Then, with a glance back to our visitor, "Miss Stoner, your courage has been tested beyond measure. You have come to us in time. Tell me, does your stepfather know you have sought my aid?" Her face blanched. "I slipped out before dawn, taking a dog-cart from the Crown Inn. He must not know I am here." "Excellent. Then you must return at once, and say nothing. Watson and I shall follow upon the noon train. Meanwhile, I would entreat you to remain as much as possible away from that chamber tonight. Should he question you, feign illness, or some other excuse, only be cautious, for your peril is very real." She rose, her relief evident though still tinged with dread. "I shall do as you bid, Mr. Holmes. God grant you may succeed where all others have failed." When she had gone, Holmes stood motionless for a time, his brow furrowed in thought. Then, without warning, he crossed to the mantel and seized his clay pipe, packing it with quick, sharp movements. "This case, Watson, presents certain features which make it unique in our experience," said he between puffs. "Consider. A young woman dies in a sealed room. Her last words an enigma. Her sister, about to be married and thus entitled to her share of the estate, is placed in the same chamber and hears the same unaccountable sound. A stepfather of violent temper, ruined finances, exotic animals at large, gypsies upon the grounds, each a thread. But how to weave them?" "You believe, then," I asked, "that Julia was murdered?" Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke. "I believe nothing, Watson. I see certain facts that will admit but one interpretation, though its nature is not yet apparent. But of this I am sure. Unless we act swiftly, Miss Stoner will follow her sister to the grave." The solemnity of his words chilled me. Yet, even as dread crept upon me, I felt the stirrings of that old excitement which only a case of the most perplexing order could rouse in Holmes. He leaned toward me, eyes blazing. "Come, my dear fellow, pack your revolver. By the time the sun sets this evening, we shall stand within the very walls of Stoke Moran, and there, I fancy, we shall pluck from obscurity the deadly secret of the Speckled band." The midday train to Leatherhead bore us swiftly through the budding fields of Surrey, though my mind was too troubled to take note of the countryside. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame bent forward, his keen eyes fixed upon the shifting patterns of smoke from his pipe. I had learned long ago that silence in such moments was the greatest service I could render him, for in the depths of that stillness his mind moved like a machine, assembling scattered facts into a single coherent chain. When at last he spoke, it was in that quiet, measured tone which I had come to recognize as the herald of deduction. "Watson, let us review what is known, and weigh each fact as a juryman must. We have a violent guardian with a financial motive, a victim who spoke of a speckled band, a household inhabited by exotic creatures, and a second young lady now threatened under identical circumstances. All signs point inward, towards Stoke Moran itself. Yet the method eludes us. No marks, no poison detected, and yet death arrives swift and cruel." "You suspect some mechanical contrivance, perhaps?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "If so, it is one of diabolical subtlety. I incline toward a force of nature, guided by the human hand. But let us not anticipate. Observation must precede theory, else we wander in darkness. That is why, Watson, we go not merely to question, but to see. We arrived at the small station and engaged a trap, the lane carrying us past hedgerows and neglected fields. Presently, the dark silhouette of Stoke Moran rose before us, its gables leaning as though in weariness, ivy clinging to its crumbling stones. The air about the place seemed heavy with neglect and silence, broken only by the distant call of some unseen bird. Miss Stoner awaited us at the gate, her expression one of mingled relief and apprehension. She led us quickly up the overgrown path, speaking in low tones. "He has gone to town for the day, Mr. Holmes. I dared not summon you otherwise. We have until dusk, when he is due to return." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "Time enough, I trust, to take the measure of this house." She guided us first through the entrance hall, where dust lay thick upon the floor and cobwebs draped the corners. The walls bore the faded remnants of former grandeur, stained portraits, a cracked mirror, a moth-eaten tapestry. The effect was one of decay, of something once stately, now surrendered to ruin. Holmes passed swiftly from chamber to chamber, his keen gaze darting to ceilings, corners, locks, and shutters, while his hands tested sills, hinges, and cords with practiced precision. I followed, my notebook in hand, though I confess many of his pauses and gestures were a mystery to me. At last he entered Julia's old chamber, now Helen's, and there he lingered long, his face stern with concentration. The room was plainly furnished, a small bed, a dressing table, a chair, a narrow fireplace with a bell-pull dangling beside it. Holmes examined each feature minutely. He tugged at the bell rope, and it gave beneath his fingers, yet made no answering clang. He traced it upward with his gaze to where it was fastened to a hook above, yet no wire led thence to the ceiling. "Curious," he murmured. "A dummy, and for what purpose?" He next approached the ventilator set in the wall just above the bed's head, a narrow square opening no larger than a man's palm. It communicated not with the outer air, but with the adjoining chamber. Holmes set the lamp beneath it, and I saw the faint outline of a passage between. "A ventilator that does not ventilate, a bell-pull that does not ring," said Holmes, his voice low, yet charged with energy. "Two false devices, placed here with design. And observe, Watson, the bed is clamped to the floor. It cannot be moved from beneath that vent." The realization sent a chill through me. Then something might pass through. Holmes raised his hand. "Patience. Let us complete the survey." We stepped softly into Dr. Roylott's own chamber. It was larger, darker, its furnishings sparse, save for a camp bed, a chest of drawers, and a large iron safe upon which lay a saucer of milk. A small dog lash, knotted into a loop, hung from the bedpost. Holmes bent over these articles with an intensity that seemed almost fierce. "What say you, Watson, to milk left with no sign of cat or dog, and a leash without hound or mastiff to claim it? Combine that with a vent communicating directly to this chamber. Does the pattern begin to stir?" I felt a stirring of dread, though the true import escaped me. "You mean that something is kept within that safe?" Holmes did not reply at once. Instead, he crouched low, pressing his ear against the metal surface, then straightened abruptly. "We shall not tamper further. The evidence is sufficient, and the danger too. Great! Miss Stoner, you must do exactly as I command if we are to preserve your life." She listened, wide-eyed, as he outlined his plan. She was to excuse herself early, pleading fatigue, and withdraw to her stepfather's disused chamber at the far end of the corridor. There she must remain locked within until we summoned her. Holmes and I would take her place within Julia's room in darkness, and there keep vigil until the truth revealed itself. "Courage, Miss Stoner," Holmes said gravely. "I believe we stand upon the very threshold of discovery. The same fate that carried off your sister may be tempted once more, but this time it shall find us waiting." When she had departed, Holmes turned to me with a rare intensity. "Watson, bring your revolver and keep it close. Tonight we sit within the shadow of death, and it may take all our strength to hold it at bay. Yet mark my words, before another dawn breaks over Stoke Moran, the secret of the Speckled band will lie bare." Evening fell heavy upon the house, the last rays of sunlight bleeding crimson across the windows before yielding to the pall of night. We sat together in silence until the hour was ripe, then crept into Julia's chamber, extinguished the lamp, and stationed ourselves in the pitch-dark gloom. I heard Holmes settle into his chair beside the bed. his voice little more than a whisper. "Not a sound, Watson. Whatever may come, you must not stir until I give the word." So began that long and fearful vigil, in which every creak of timber and sigh of wind seemed laden with menace, and in which the memory of Julia's final cry pressed upon us both like the weight of a ghost. The hours of that dreadful night passed with an oppressive slowness that gnawed at the nerves. We had taken our station just as Holmes had ordered. The chamber plunged into complete darkness, save for the faint glow of starlight filtering through the shutters. I sat, tense, revolver gripped tightly in my hand, every sense straining for the faintest hint of movement. Holmes, beside me, was still as a statue. It seemed as though the very house itself held its breath, listening with us for the approach of that nameless peril. Now and again a floorboard creaked in some distant part of the building, or the wind moaned faintly through the ivy outside. Once I thought I heard the padding of soft paws across the gravel path below, perhaps the cheetah Helen had spoken of, yet Holmes's immovable calm stilled any thought of stirring. He had impressed upon me that even the slightest exclamation or movement at the wrong moment might prove fatal. At length the silence was broken by a sound so slight I thought it born of imagination, a faint, low whistle, clear and deliberate in the stillness of the night. My heart leapt into my throat. Holmes's hand brushed against my arm in a silent warning, urging me to remain composed. A few seconds later I detected another noise, a soft, sinuous rustle, as though something was sliding, slow and deliberate, along the rope that hung beside the bed. Though the darkness shrouded all, I felt a wave of cold dread sweep over me. The faintest beam of starlight caught upon something moving, a thin, glistening shape, alive with a terrible vitality, coiling its way down the bell rope toward the pillow. I realized in horror that it was a snake, its scales faintly speckled, its head lifted in silent menace. Holmes sprang into action with a suddenness that shattered the awful stillness. Seizing his cane, he lashed furiously at the rope, striking the creature again and again with a rapid precision that startled me. A hideous hiss cut the air, followed by a sound of something striking the floor. Then, in an instant, the serpent was gone, retreating swiftly through the ventilator into the adjoining chamber. There was a dreadful pause. Then a cry, piercing and terrible, rang out from Dr. Roylott's room. It was a sound so charged with agony and rage that it seemed scarcely human, a scream that rose, broke into a choking gasp, and was cut short with awful suddenness. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Holmes caught my arm, his voice a whisper, urgent but steady. "Quick, Watson! The matter is resolved. Come with me." We hurried into the adjoining chamber. The lamp upon the table revealed a sight so ghastly that it will remain forever etched upon my memory. Dr. Grimesby Roylott lay upon his bed, his features twisted in a rictus of pain, his limbs rigid. Coiled about his brow, its head sunk low upon the pillow, was the very creature Holmes had beaten back, a swamp adder, its body marked with the dull speckles that had given rise to Julia's dying words. Holmes, with calm precision, seized the dog-lash and looped it about the creature's neck, drawing it away from the corpse and forcing it back into the iron safe, which he locked securely. The saucer of milk still stood upon the safe, mute testimony to the unnatural companionship between master and serpent. I turned from the sight of Roylott's distorted face, my stomach sickened by the realization of the man's fate. Holmes, however, stood silent for a moment, his keen gaze fixed upon the scene, as though piecing together the last fragments of a puzzle already mastered. At last he spoke. "It is fitting," he said gravely, "that he should perish by the very devilish contrivance he he had devised for another. The swamp adder, deadliest snake in all India. Its venom is swift, leaving no mark, saving death within seconds. He kept it here, training it with milk, guiding it by the lash, sending it nightly through the ventilator, down the false bell rope, onto the bed clamped beneath. Thus Julia was slain, and thus her sister was marked for the same fate. But tonight, Watson, we were ready. The horror of it all overcame me. Good heavens, Holmes! Such a scheme, so infernal a cruelty, I scarcely believe a human mind could conceive it. Holmes closed the Taffy Ass, safe, and straightened his features grave. There is no limit to human greed when joined with an ungovernable temper. Remember, Watson, each daughter stood between him and financial ruin. He dared not openly strike them down. Too obvious, too perilous for his own freedom. But by so subtle and exotic a weapon as this, he thought himself safe. No jury in England would suspect, no doctor could prove. It was the perfect crime, until Julia's dying words betrayed him. She saw only a speckled band, but it was enough. I pieced together the rest. We returned quietly to the corridor, where Helen Stoner awaited us, pale and trembling. Holmes spoke with a gentleness rare in his manner. "Your stepfather will trouble you no more, Miss Stoner. The danger has passed, though the cost is dreadful. Come, Watson, we shall see her safely conveyed to her relatives before we return to London." As we departed the ruined house, the first pallor of dawn touched the sky, casting Stoke Moran in a cold, unforgiving light. I could not help but glance back at its broken walls and shuttered windows, feeling as though we had stepped from the very lair of evil itself. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his expression unreadable, until at last he spoke, his voice subdued. "I take no pleasure in the death of such a wicked man, Watson, but my conscience is clear. He lost the hound of death, and it turned upon him. There is justice in that I said nothing, for the image of the speckled band still writhed before my eyes, and the memory of that terrible cry lingered in my ears. Yet I knew, as ever, that Holmes had seen more keenly than all others, and that it was his vigilance alone which had delivered Helen Stoner from her sister's fate. Thus ended the matter of the speckled band, a tale of greed and cruelty so sinister that even as I set down these lines, I felt anew the shudder that haunted me on that night of terror at Stoke Moran. Though the tragedy of Stoke Moran might well have concluded with Dr. Roylott's terrible end, the days that followed revealed that the affair was not so neatly contained as Holmes or I first imagined. Indeed, it was upon our return to Baker Street that the case, though closed, took on a fresh complexion which tested Holmes's deductive powers anew. Helen Stoner had been placed with relatives in Harrow, and it was with some relief that Holmes and I returned to our accustomed routine. Yet scarcely 3 days had passed before Inspector Lestrade appeared at our door, his familiar, sharp features more pinched than usual, his manner at once vexed and deferential. "You may recall, Mr. Holmes," said he, settling into the armchair Holmes indicated, "that I expressed no small skepticism in past cases of yours. But this time, I am bound to say, it seems the whole matter at Stoke Moran has raised questions at headquarters. We are asked to inquire into certain details that remain unsettled." Holmes, lounging upon the sofa, with his long fingers pressed together, regarded him with mild curiosity. "Unsettled, Lestrade? You have a corpse, a venomous serpent, and a motive as clear as daylight. What shadow could possibly remain?" Lestrade shifted uneasily. "The difficulty, Mr. Holmes, is that not a single villager swears to seeing this serpent outside the house. Moreover, though the safe contained the creature, there is doubt as to whether Roylott could have kept such a beast alive for long in our climate." The yard fears there may be more to it. Some whisper of accomplices, the gypsies perhaps, or even that the young lady herself had some hand. It would ease matters considerably if you could set down in writing the full chain of your reasoning. Holmes gave a thin smile. Ah, the official mind, ever eager for the neatly typed report. Yet it is not without reason. Very well, Lestrade, I shall humour you. But I warn you, what follows will not flatter your department's perspicacity. He rose and paced the room as he spoke, his words measured and precise. The snake was trained to return through the ventilator at the whistle of its master. The saucer of milk kept it docile, and the lash ensured obedience. Its venom, subtle and rapid, left no trace. The ventilator, the dummy rope, the fixed bed, all bespoke design. Roylott, faced with financial ruin, removed his stepdaughter to her death chamber when she became inconvenient. In attempting the same upon Helen, he was thwarted by our presence, and the creature, enraged by my blows, turned upon him instead. There is no mystery left, save in the minds of those who prefer shadows to substance. Lestrade listened, his pencil scratching in his notebook, though his expression betrayed lingering doubt. "It is well enough, Mr. Holmes. But if I may say so, there are whispers too of a letter found in Roylott's papers, an unsigned note with but a line, 'The band will not serve you,' twice. Do you account for that?" Holmes paused, his brow knitting for the first time. He extended his hand sharply. "You have this note?" "Not yet. The local constable holds it, but I thought it right to bring the matter to you first." "Bring it here without delay," said Holmes curtly. "Until I see it, I shall not hazard an opinion. But mark me, Lestrade, if this be true, then the affair of the Speckled band is not ended." When the inspector had departed, Holmes remained at the window, his gaze fixed upon the smoke drifting above Baker Street. His silence was long, and when at last he spoke, it was half to himself. "A warning note, Watson. An unseen hand aware of Roylott's scheme. If so, then we face not a solitary villain, but a deeper design, I confess, that unease gripped me. You do not suppose, Holmes, that another sought to employ the same monstrous device?" He turned, his eyes alight with that fierce energy I had seen so often when a problem quickened his intellect. "It is a possibility, my dear fellow, and one we must not ignore. Evil seldom acts in isolation. If there is more to be unearthed, we must trace it to its root. Tonight, Watson, I propose we review every scrap of testimony, every movement of those gypsies, every unexplained feature of Stoke Moran, for I fear that Helen Stoner may yet be in danger, even though her stepfather lies cold in his grave." The following evening Lestrade returned, carrying a small envelope sealed with wax. Holmes broke it open with swift precision. The paper within was coarse, the handwriting disguised in a heavy scrawl. The message contained only the words Lestrade had quoted. "The band will not serve you twice." There was no signature, no address. Holmes examined it under the glass, then held it to the lamp, scrutinizing the fibres. A common stationery, sold at tobacconists in a dozen quarters of London. Ink of inferior quality. Yet observe, Watson, here at the margin, the faint impression of another word, as though penned upon a sheet laid above this one. Let us see what my lens may coax forth with delicate care. He traced the indentation. Slowly, faintly, the letters revealed themselves. Moran. Holmes's face grew grave. "So, we have stumbled into deeper waters indeed, for the name Moran is not unknown to us, Watson. Colonel Sebastian Moran, the most dangerous man in London since the fall of Moriarty. If he has stooped to involve himself in this affair, then the serpent was but the beginning." A chill settled upon me, as though the case, far from ending with Roylott's demise, had only now begun to show its true face. Holmes, however, seemed almost invigorated, his whole being alive with the prospect of pursuit. "We must move swiftly," he said, pocketing the note. "The colonel plays for high stakes, and we must be prepared for cunning equal to his cruelty." This warning was not meant for Roylott alone. It is a challenge, Watson, flung down at our very feet. Thus it was that what began as the strange tragedy of a speckled band now widened into a larger, more perilous game, one in which we would soon find ourselves pitted against a foe as calculating as he was deadly. And though I did not yet know it, the true test of Holmes's genius still lay before us. Holmes wasted no time in allowing our thoughts to stagnate. The following morning, before even the breakfast tray had cooled upon the table, he was already issuing brisk instructions with the air of a general setting forth a campaign. "Watson, fetch your coat. We must make for Surrey once more. The letter, the snake, Roylott's ruin, all point in one direction, yet we must tread carefully, for if Colonel Moran's hand lies behind this, we are not dealing with some coarse provincial brute, but with one of the most dangerous minds in Europe." The name alone carried with it a certain chill. I remembered the accounts of Moran that Holmes had once recounted. A soldier of fortune, second only to Moriarty in cunning and ruthlessness, an expert marksman and hunter who had turned his skills to darker pursuits. That such a man might weave his shadow into the tragedy of Stoke Moran filled me with apprehension. Our journey was swift and silent. Holmes, deep in thought, sat rigid, his eyes half closed, while I pondered what link might exist between the late Dr. Roylott and Moran. It was upon the neglected road approaching the estate that Holmes at last spoke. "Roylott was a pawn, Watson, though he fancied himself the player. His violence and greed made him malleable to subtler hands. Consider, how else could a country physician, fallen into ruin, acquire a swamp adder, the rarest, most deadly serpent of the Indian jungles? Such a prize is not without connections. Colonel Moran, with his colonial service and hunting expeditions, could have procured it with ease. The serpent was supplied, the method instructed, the motive sharpened by poverty. Roylott struck, but Moran stood behind. The grim outline grew clearer with every mile. When at last the gaunt towers of Stoke Moran rose into view, the air about them seemed more desolate than before, as though the very house resented its master's fate. Holmes bade our driver halt some distance from the gate, and we approached on foot, moving silently along the hedgerow. Within the grounds, the gypsy camp still smouldered with the remains of last night's fire. Two dark figures loitered near the tattered tents, their eyes narrowing as Holmes and I passed. He returned their gaze with no more than a curt nod, but I could sense his mind registering every detail, the cut of their coats, the stains upon their boots, the faint bulge of a concealed blade. We found the local constable awaiting us by prior arrangement, and with his key we entered the shuttered house. The rooms were cold, heavy with the odor of mildew and decay. Holmes strode directly to Roylott's chamber, where the iron safe still stood. The serpent had been destroyed by the authorities after our discovery, yet the saucer of milk remained, as though frozen in time. Holmes bent low, examining the scratches upon the floorboards, the faint scuff marks about the safe's base. "Dragged, Watson. The safe has been shifted of late, and see here, residue of oil about the hinges, quite new. Someone else has tampered with this place since Roylott's death." A sound above caused us to start, the faint tread of a boot upon the upper landing. The constable moved to intercept, but Holmes raised a hand, his face alight with sudden concentration. "No, let him come. We may learn more by observation than by confrontation." Moments later, a man descended the stair. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the carriage of a soldier and eyes that glittered with cold amusement. His moustache bristled, his step was firm, and his glance fell upon us with the easy insolence of one accustomed to command. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, unless I mistake," he said, in a smooth, mocking tone. "I am Colonel Sebastian Moran. You have the advantage of me, sir, though I dare say it shall not last." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "The honour is mine, Colonel. We were just admiring the late Dr. Roylott's arrangements. Ingenious, were they not? One could almost suppose he had guidance." Moran's lips curved in a thin smile. The man was a fool. He had the makings of an artist in crime, yet lacked the discipline. He grew reckless, careless, and so he perished by his own tool. A pity. "You speak with curious familiarity," Holmes remarked, his tone cool, "as though you had some stake in the matter." The Colonel's eyes hardened. "I know nothing of it. I am here merely to settle affairs between the Roylott estate and certain acquaintances of mine. A personal matter, you understand?" Holmes's reply was sharp. "Oh, I understand perfectly. You come not to mourn, but to erase traces of your hand. But you will find, Colonel, that the game is not so easily won when the board is watched." The silence that followed was taut with menace. Moran's hand twitched as though toward his coat, but finding 3 pairs of eyes fixed upon him, he let it fall with a faint laugh. "You are bold, Holmes. Too bold, perhaps. I warn you, there are forces at play beyond your comprehension. Best leave the dead to bury their dead." With that, he turned on his heel and strode from the chamber, his boots ringing upon the flagstones. Holmes waited until the echo faded before speaking. "He will not forgive this encounter, Watson. Already I see the shadow of his vengeance gathering. The case has grown larger than I feared. Yet, is it not infinitely more instructive?" That night, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes sat once more in brooding silence, his pipe unlit, his gaze fixed upon some vision far beyond the carriage window. At length he spoke, his voice low, resolute. "We have stirred the tiger, Watson. Moran will strike, and when he does, we must be ready. Mark me. This is no longer the affair of a ruined doctor and his stepdaughters. We have crossed swords with the very successor of Moriarty himself, and if we fail, it shall not be for want of warning." The city lights loomed ahead, but I could not shake the sense that the darkness following us was deeper than any London fog, and that the true peril of the Speckled band had only just begun. The encounter with Colonel Moran left a lingering unease that clung to me throughout the following day. Holmes, however, betrayed no sign of apprehension. If anything, the confrontation seemed to have awakened within him a sharpened vitality, as though the very danger quickened his faculties. He paced our sitting-room with restless energy, pausing only to jot cryptic notes upon scraps of paper or to consult one of the thick volumes that filled our shelves. At length he halted before the window, gazing down upon the bustling thoroughfare below. "Moran will not suffer humiliation, Watson. He is a hunter by instinct, and we are his quarry. Yet let us not forget, when the tiger springs, he exposes himself to the spear. Our task is not to flee, but to prepare." "You believe, then," I ventured, "that he will attempt violence against us?" Holmes gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Violence is his métier. Poisoned darts, air guns, snares. These are the instruments of his trade, yet he will not strike blindly. No, Watson, he will lure us, as he lured poor Roylott with promises of power and profit. The serpent was but a prelude. His true design lies hidden still, and we must discover it before his net closes about us." Our musings were interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing a letter. Holmes slit it open with his penknife. his expression sharpening as he read. As I expected. Helen Stoner. I leaned forward anxiously. She is safe, surely. She is alarmed, Holmes replied, handing me the note. In a trembling hand she had written that 2 strangers had called at her relative's house the previous evening, asking impertinent questions about her late stepfather's affairs. They had not given their names, but one had a military bearing, and she felt certain she had seen him before near the gypsy encampment at Stoke Moran. Her relatives were anxious, and she begged Holmes's counsel. Holmes folded the letter thoughtfully. The Colonel wastes no time. He means to silence or ensnare the one witness who might yet speak to his dealings. Watson, we go to Harrow at once. The journey was swift, and by late afternoon we arrived at the modest country house where Miss Stoner had taken refuge. She received us with visible relief, though her face was pale and her hands trembled as she clasped mine. Holmes, ever sparing with sentiment, merely inclined his head before proceeding directly to business. "You saw these men plainly?" he asked. "As plainly as I see you, sir." One tall, broad-shouldered, with fierce eyes and a heavy moustache. The other younger, slighter, with a scar across his cheek. They spoke little, but I felt in my heart they meant me harm. Holmes nodded. "Your instincts are sound. You must remain here under guard. Watson, you will oblige me by staying tonight as her protector. I, meanwhile, have other work that cannot be delayed," I protested at once. "Surely, Holmes, you cannot mean to face Moran alone." His smile was faint, almost indulgent. "My dear fellow, solitude is often the best disguise. Be assured I shall not act rashly, but the Colonel will move swiftly, and if I am to counter him, I must do so with equal speed. Guard Miss Stoner with your life, Watson. The burden of her safety rests with you." With that he departed, leaving me restless and uneasy. Yet his words admitted no argument, and so I remained at the house, keeping vigil through the long night hours. Nothing disturbed our watch, but my thoughts were filled with foreboding, for I knew Holmes was abroad upon some perilous errand, pitting his wits against an adversary as dangerous as any we had faced. It was not until the following afternoon that he returned, his coat dusted from travel, his eyes gleaming with suppressed triumph. He would not speak until we were alone, and even then he paced the chamber before revealing what he had learned. "I traced our Colonel to a disreputable tavern in Lambeth, a haunt of old soldiers and worse. There he conferred with his scar-faced associate, whose name, I have since discovered, is Travers, once a sergeant under him in India. They spoke freely, thinking themselves unobserved. Watson, I tell you, the serpent was not Roylott's alone. Moran supplied it as part of a wider commerce in strange and deadly beasts, creatures smuggled from the colonies, sold to collectors, and at times employed for darker uses. The swamp adder was but one of many such weapons in his arsenal. The revelation chilled me. Then Roylott's crime was but a single strand in a larger web? Precisely. And Moran now fears that strand may lead back to him. He means to sever it, by striking at Miss Stoner. That is why we must set a trap, one baited with her apparent vulnerability, yet strong enough to snare the hunter himself. Though my heart misgave me at the thought of exposing Helen to further danger, Holmes's tone brooked no hesitation. His plan, as he outlined it, was daring in the extreme. Miss Stoner would appear to return to London under guard, lodging at Baker Street for a few nights. Word of her presence there would inevitably reach Moran's ears through his spies. Holmes would prepare the flat with certain precautions, and together we would await the Colonel's move. "Tonight, Watson," he concluded, his eyes gleaming with fierce anticipation, "the game advances to its next stage. The serpent struck unseen, but the tiger must strike openly. When he does, we shall be ready." And so it was that as dusk fell once more upon the city, Helen Stoner, though trembling, agreed to place her trust wholly in Holmes. With a courage born of desperation, she consented to play her part in the perilous stratagem. As she crossed the threshold of Baker Street that evening, the shadows lengthened across the crowded street, and I could not help but feel that behind some corner, in some window, the eyes of Colonel Sebastian Moran already marked our every step. The plan, once conceived, was executed with Holmes's customary precision. Miss Stoner was installed in our sitting room at Baker Street, her presence visible enough to those who watched the ebb and flow of traffic outside. Holmes had already arranged that her relatives in Harrow would spread word of her departure, thus ensuring the Colonel's spies could confirm the rumor. It was, in effect, an invitation to strike. Holmes spared no effort in preparing our quarters. He examined every shutter and fastening, tested the locks, and shifted the furniture so that vantage and concealment were equally provided. The lamps were adjusted to burn low, casting deceptive shadows across the room. He even positioned Helen's chair so that, from the street, her silhouette might be clearly discerned against the curtain, a decoy of remarkable subtlety. "You see, Watson," he explained with quiet satisfaction, "the Colonel will rely upon distance and precision. He will not risk open entry, not while a surer means is at his disposal. It is the window he will choose, and it is there we must watch." I could not suppress a shudder as I glanced at the glass panes which looked down upon the bustling thoroughfare. The thought of unseen eyes and hidden weapons fixed upon them filled me with dread. Yet Holmes appeared invigorated by the peril. Miss Stoner, poor soul, bore her part with admirable fortitude. Though pale and anxious, she spoke no word of complaint, and when Holmes bade her retirement early to a chamber at the back of the house, well out of harm's way, she obeyed without protest. It was her figure, not her person, that remained seated in the lamplight. Holmes had contrived a clever arrangement of cloak and bonnet upon a frame, such that to an observer below it seemed she still occupied the chair. Thus the stage was set. Holmes extinguished all but a single shaded lamp, and we crouched together in the gloom, our eyes fixed upon the curtained window. The street below was quieting as the hour grew late, the noise of wheels diminishing, the calls of vendors fading into the distance. A hush seemed to settle over Baker Street, heavy with expectation. Midnight had just struck when Holmes's hand gripped my arm with sudden force. "There!" he whispered. Following his gaze, I discerned the faintest glimmer of movement upon the opposite rooftop. A figure crouched in the shadow, scarcely visible against the night sky, but unmistakable to the trained eye. The silhouette was that of a man prone, his shoulders bent, his arms extended with the deliberate poise of a marksman. Even at that distance, there was no mistaking the deadly intent. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The air gun, Watson. Von Herder's invention. Silent, accurate, and fatal. It is Moran beyond doubt." Before I could speak, a faint crack, barely audible, broke the silence. There was a soft thud as the bullet embedded itself in the back of the chair where Helen's form appeared to sit. The bonnet quivered, and a tiny puff of dust rose from the cushion. Holmes was already in motion. He sprang to the window, flung it open, and with a shrill whistle gave a prearranged signal. Instantly, 2 plainclothes constables stationed below at his request dashed into the street. Moran, startled at his failure, leapt to his feet and attempted to flee across the roof. But Holmes, revolver in hand, leaned from the window, his voice ringing clear above the din. "Surrender, Colonel! You are covered!" For a moment, Moran hesitated, his form outlined against the starlit sky. Then, with a snarl of rage, he cast aside the weapon and raised his hands. The constables clambered up from the adjoining stair and seized him. The struggle was brief, for though he fought with the strength of desperation, he was outnumbered and overpowered. Moments later, he was brought down into the street, his wrists bound, his face twisted with hatred. Holmes and I descended swiftly. In the lamplight, I saw Moran's eyes blaze with fury as he was thrust into the waiting cab. He turned them full upon Holmes, and his voice was low yet venomous. "You think you have won, Holmes. But this was but a skirmish. There are others who will carry on what Moriarty began. You cannot root us all out." Holmes regarded him with cold disdain. "Your words betray you, Moran. You are no Moriarty, but a pale reflection. He built an empire of crime. You skulk with reptiles and air guns. The game is over, and you have lost." The cab door slammed, and Moran was borne away to Scotland Yard under heavy guard. Only then did Holmes allow himself a slow breath, his eyes softening as he turned toward me. "It is well, Watson. The spear has found the tiger, yet I do not think I take triumph in it. Moran is but one head of a hydra, and others may rise. Still, tonight we have spared Miss Stoner a second ordeal, and that is no small victory." When we returned upstairs, Helen emerged from the inner chamber, pale yet unharmed. Holmes reassured her with a rare gentleness. "It is finished, Miss Stoner. Your courage has carried you through, and the net that threatened to ensnare you has been torn apart. You may now begin your life anew, free of fear." Tears glistened in her eyes as she clasped his hand, unable to speak. For myself, I could not but marvel at Holmes's foresight, the trap so carefully prepared, the adversary anticipated at every turn, the danger met with unwavering nerve. As dawn broke over London, the fog lifting to reveal a sky of pale gold, Holmes settled into his chair, his pipe between his lips, the faintest trace of weariness upon his features. Yet even then his eyes gleamed with that restless fire which no triumph could quench. "There will be other cases, Watson," he murmured, half to himself. "There are always other cases. But for now let us be content. The deadly secret of the Speckled band has been laid bare, and the hunter himself lies caged." And with that he lapsed into silence, while outside the city stirred once more to life, oblivious to the deadly game that had been played upon its rooftops in the still hours of the night. The arrest of Colonel Sebastian Moran might have seemed to close the circle, yet Holmes was not one to rest content with appearances. While the Yard congratulated itself on securing such a notorious villain, Holmes paced our sitting-room with a restlessness that betrayed no sense of finality. The Colonel's capture was, in his words, a decisive stroke, but he insisted the matter of the Speckled band still concealed threads not yet unraveled. "Consider, Watson," he said as he tamped the tobacco in his pipe, "a serpent trained as a weapon, an air gun perfected for silent murder, and a chain of letters that bound a ruined country doctor to the second of Professor Moriarty. You may accept Moran's malice as sufficient, but I cannot. His words at the moment of arrest, 'Others will carry on what Moriarty began,' they were not idle. He spoke with the confidence of one who knows his designs are larger than himself. I could not deny the weight of his reasoning. Yet I was weary, and my mind longed for repose. Even so, Holmes, surely Moran's incarceration has served the greater danger. Miss Stoner is safe, and his schemes are thwarted. Must you seek further shadows in what is already a nightmarish affair?" Holmes turned those piercing grey eyes upon me, and I knew the answer before his lips moved. "Shadows, Watson, are but the forms of solid things not yet seen. It is my task to bring them into the light. We cannot afford to mistake respite for resolution. Events soon justified his misgivings. On the second morning after Moran's arrest, a package arrived by post addressed to Holmes. It was small, wrapped in coarse brown paper, and bore the faint scent of damp straw. Holmes opened it with care, revealing within a coiled length of snakeskin, fresh and gleaming, with a single sheet of paper folded beneath. The message was brief, scrawled in the same heavy hand as the earlier note. The band is not broken. You will hear it hiss again. Holmes studied the relic with keen attention, turning it beneath the light. A boa's skin, recently shed. Not the swamp adder, but another serpent entirely. This is a taunt, Watson, plain and deliberate. We have unmasked Moran, but someone else continues his work. The implication was chilling. I watched as Holmes sealed the object in a glass jar and set it aside on the mantel. His face was pale, but his eyes blazed with the clarity of a man who has glimpsed the outline of an unseen adversary. By noon, Lestrade himself called at Baker Street, flushed with indignation. "The devil's work, Mr. Holmes. How the thing passed through the post without suspicion, I cannot fathom. But see here, the Yard has Moran under lock and key. He cannot be responsible." "Precisely," Holmes replied coolly, "and that is why this gesture alarms me more than Moran's attempt upon Miss Stoner. A network lies behind him, one that dares strike even while its figurehead sits in chains." "Do you mean to say," Lestrade exclaimed, "that London harbours more of these villains?" Holmes's smile was thin. "London harbours half the world's villains, Inspector. The question is whether we can discern this particular nest before it stirs again." Lestrade muttered something about Holmes's habit of seeing conspiracies in every shadow, but his voice betrayed unease. He departed soon after, promising to tighten Moran's guard, though I could tell he placed little stock in the threat. That evening Holmes grew uncharacteristically silent, seated before the fire with the violin resting across his knees. He drew from it a series of low, haunting notes, each one lingering like a sigh in the stillness of the room. At length he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "There is a method in this, Watson. The serpent's skin, the hiss, the allusion to the band, all are symbols meant to continue the terror Julia Stoner's death inspired. The original crime was not merely an act of greed, but part of a pattern. Moran, Roylott, and now another, bound by serpents, secrecy, and silence. I felt a shiver pass through me. You believe, then, that a society exists devoted to such abominable devices? Not a society, perhaps, but a cabal, a circle of men who trade in the exotic and the deadly. Recall Moran's commerce in beasts of India, creatures smuggled into England. What better instruments for crimes that leave no trace? The swamp adder was but one tool in their arsenal. Others remain. The notion was dreadful, yet Holmes's conviction left little room for doubt. He rose suddenly, setting aside the violin, and took his hat from the stand. "Come, Watson. The night is young, and I would confirm my suspicion. There is a warehouse in the docks I have long suspected of housing contraband animals. Moran's arrest may have forced their hand. If we are swift, we may glimpse the serpent's nest before it coils more tightly about us." Despite my weariness, I could not refuse him. We set out into the mist-laden streets, the gas lamps casting their dim halos in the fog. Holmes strode quickly, his figure bent slightly forward, his energy driving us through the night as though pursuit itself pressed at our heels. At the river, the air grew thick with the smell of tar and brine. The wharves lay in shadow, the hulks of ships looming like giants against the darkened water. Holmes led me to a narrow lane where a dilapidated warehouse crouched at the water's edge. From within came faint sounds, a muffled thud, the scrape of wood and once a low hiss that froze my blood. Holmes placed a finger to his lips and drew me into the shelter of a stack of crates. We watched as two men emerged from the warehouse, carrying a heavy crate between them. They set it upon a waiting cart, pausing to wipe the sweat from their brows. One muttered in a foreign tongue, the other gave a low whistle in reply. Then, with a flick of the reins, they drove the cart into the night. Holmes's hand tightened upon my shoulder. "You heard it, Watson. The hiss." The band indeed is not broken. We stand upon the threshold of something vast and terrible. But mark me well. Before we are done, I mean to drag it into the light. His words struck me with a force that left no room for doubt. The deadly secret of the Speckled band had not ended with Roylott, nor with Moran. A greater peril loomed, and I sensed with foreboding that the most dangerous chapter of this strange affair was yet to be written. The damp fog coiled about us as we crouched in the shadow of the crates, the retreating rumble of cartwheels fading into the distance. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light, his expression taut with concentration. He remained motionless until the street fell silent once more, then rose with deliberate care, brushing the dust from his knees. "Did you note, Watson," he said in a low tone, "the careful manner with which those men bore their burden? That was no mere consignment of goods. The balance, the weight, alive, beyond question, and the hiss unmistakable. It confirms what I feared. We face not the echo of a single crime, but an enterprise devoted to smuggling venom and fang into the heart of London." The revelation was chilling, and I shuddered to think what malign uses such creatures might be bent toward. Holmes, however, seemed almost invigorated by the peril, his mind alight with purpose. "We must know whether that cart is bound," he continued. "Yet pursuit at this hour, without carriage of our own, would be futile. Instead, we shall return at dawn. They will come again to load their stock. Of that I am certain. But tonight we withdrew. Come, Watson. The fog is our ally, but I will not squander it." We made our way back through the labyrinth of narrow lanes until the lamps of Baker Street shone once more before us. The hours that followed were restless. Holmes, pacing ceaselessly, spoke little, while I dozed uneasily in my chair, haunted by dreams of serpents slithering through shuttered rooms. At first light, however, Holmes was alert, his lean face drawn but resolute. He summoned a cab, and together we returned to the river. The docks stirred with their customary bustle, yet Holmes's attention was fixed upon the warehouse. He led me to a vantage point where we could watch unseen. For an hour nothing stirred but gulls and stray cats. Then, at last, a door creaked open. A man emerged, tall, lean, with the unmistakable bearing of military training. His moustache bristled, his eyes wary, his every motion precise. Holmes leaned close, his voice a whisper. "Moran's lieutenant, Travers. The same scar-faced fellow Miss Stoner described. Observe him closely, Watson, for he is dangerous." Travers barked orders in a low voice, and soon more men appeared, each bent beneath heavy crates. The procession was orderly, efficient, too disciplined for common dock thieves. Holmes's gaze narrowed as he counted their number. 7, he murmured. "Enough to form a small company. This is no rabble. Moran has trained them well." The men loaded their cargo onto a waiting barge moored at the wharf. From one crate escaped a sound so faint that only Holmes and I, straining, could hear it, the dry rasp of scales against wood. I felt my throat tighten, recalling Julia Stoner's last words. Holmes scribbled a note in his pocketbook. "They sail by the river, Watson. Likely to some hidden warehouse further upstream. If these serpents are loosed upon the black market, no man, woman, or child will be safe. Yet we cannot intervene without proof. We must see where the trail leads. The barge set off, its dark shape gliding silently through the morning mist. Holmes hailed a waterman, and in moments we were following at a cautious distance, our small skiff dwarfed by the sluggish current. The pursuit was tense, every ripple upon the Thames magnified by the pounding of my heart. For nearly an hour we shadowed them, the fog rising and falling, until the barge turned sharply into a secluded inlet where an abandoned mill crouched upon the bank. Its windows were shattered, its timbers rotting, yet smoke drifted faintly from a chimney. The barge moored, and the men began unloading their perilous cargo. Holmes's hand touched my arm. "Here lies their lair. The mill serves as cover for their traffic. We must observe, record, and then strike with precision. Only the yard, armed with irrefutable evidence, can sweep this nest." We crept closer along the reeds until we could peer through a gap in the boards. Within, the sight was grotesque. Crates stood open, revealing cages of snakes coiled and hissing, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. Alongside them were jars of venom, carefully sealed, and bundles of nets and lashes for their handling. Travers moved among them with practiced ease, his scarred face lit by a lantern's glow. Holmes' expression grew grim. "This, Watson, is the true Speckled band, not a single serpent, but an organized trade in death. With such weapons, they could silence enemies, extort the wealthy, spread terror unchecked. Roylott was but a trial run, Moran a lieutenant. Here is the armory of their empire." The sight was enough to chill the stoutest heart. I could scarcely restrain myself from rushing in, revolver drawn, yet Holmes's hand restrained me. "Patience, my friend. Evidence first, action after. One misstep, and we are lost." We withdrew as quietly as we had come, returning to our skiff. Holmes sat silent, his eyes fixed upon the horizon as we drifted back into the current. At length he spoke, his tone grave yet tinged with fierce determination. "Tonight we shall summon Lestrade. He will scoff, no doubt, but when we lead him here, he will find proof enough to silence even the most obstinate doubter. This, Watson, is the culmination of our case. The serpent's den lies open before us. But mark me, when we strike, Travers will fight like a cornered beast, and Moran, though caged, may yet have loyal hands to act for him. We must be ready for blood." The sun broke through the fog then, casting a pale gold across the river, yet its light seemed powerless to dispel the shadows that clung about us. I felt, with a certainty I could not shake, that we had glimpsed but the edge of a greater darkness, and that the battle which lay ahead would test Holmes's genius and my own courage as no case before. It was late the following evening when Holmes, Lestrade, and I returned to the desolate mill on the Thames, our boat skimming across the black waters under cover of moonlight. Holmes had persuaded the inspector with uncharacteristic intensity, and though Lestrade still muttered about wild goose chases, he had brought a squad of constables, their pistols at the ready. The mill loomed before us, its broken windows glowing faintly with the light of lanterns. From within came the low murmur of voices, and once the unmistakable hiss of something alive. Holmes's hand touched my shoulder as we crouched in the reeds. "Remember, Watson, silence is our ally. Lestrade, surround the building, but hold your men until I give a signal. Travers is no fool, and should he suspect an ambush, he may lose those creatures in desperation." We crept forward, Holmes and I taking the lead. Through the cracks in the timbered wall I could see Travers and his men, their lanterns swinging over crates and cages. A pair of serpents writhed in glass jars, their scales glinting. Bundles of documents lay scattered on a table, shipping manifests, coded letters, even bank drafts. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "There is our evidence, Watson, the full measure of their commerce in death." Suddenly, Travers raised his head, his scar catching the lamplight. "Quiet!" he barked, and the room fell still. For an instant, I thought we had been discovered. Then I heard it too, the faint crunch of boots on gravel, one of Lestrade's men too eager for his part. Travers's eyes narrowed, and with a curse he seized a cage, flinging it toward the door. Holmes did not hesitate. He thrust the door wide, his revolver gleaming, and his voice rang sharp and commanding. "Scotland Yard! You are surrounded! Surrender at once, Travers, or by heaven I shall put a bullet through you before your pets can stir." The room erupted into chaos. Men lunged for weapons, but the crash of constables breaking through the windows and doors stunned them. A serpent slithered free, its body sliding across the floor, but Holmes struck it away with his cane before it could coil. Shots rang out, shouts echoed, and in the tumult, Travers himself grappled with Holmes, his scarred face twisted with fury. I rushed to aid my friend, but Holmes fought with the desperate strength of one who knows the contest will end only in death or victory. At last, with a swift movement, he twisted free and brought the butt of his revolver down upon Travers's temple. The man crumpled, insensible. Within minutes the others were subdued, their weapons stripped, their serpents secured within their cages. Lestrade, flushed and breathless, surveyed the wreckage with mingled relief and astonishment. "By the Lord, Mr. Holmes, you were right after all." As this as one turned, "Infernal gang, and we've caught them red-handed. The Yard will be in your debt for years to come." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Spare me your compliments, Lestrade. See instead that every scrap of paper is gathered, every man placed under heavy guard. This was no mere band of smugglers. It was the residue of Moriarty's web, men who sought to arm themselves with nature's deadliest creatures. We have cut one branch, but others may yet remain." The prisoners were led away, Travers among them, his head bound, but his eyes still burning with hatred. The serpents, carefully contained, were taken to the Zoological Society for safe disposal. Only when the mill lay silent once more did Holmes allow himself to breathe freely. We stood together on the river bank, the moonlight silvering the water. Holmes, his face pale with fatigue, spoke in a low, contemplative tone. "Thus ends the affair of the Speckled band, Watson. Julius Stoner's dying cry has led us far, from the chamber at Stoke Moran to Moran's rooftop ambush to this lair upon the Thames. The serpent was never one alone, but many, bound by greed and cunning into a brotherhood of death. Roylott was their instrument, Moran their hand, Travers their steward. Now they are broken. I could not help but marvel at the chain of deduction that had brought us to this point." "And Helen Stoner?" I asked quietly. Holmes' expression softened. "She is free at last from the shadow that blighted her life. That is enough reward. As for us, Watson, the game is done. Let others untangle the remnants. We have pulled the sting from the serpent." The journey back to Baker Street was silent. Dawn was breaking when we reached our familiar sitting room, the fire still glowing faintly in the grate. Holmes sank into his chair, his violin resting across his knees. For a time he was lost in thought, the smoke from his pipe curling about him in ghostly spirals. At length he spoke, almost to himself. "Strange, is it not, that man, in his thirst for dominion, will harness even the venom of beasts to his own malice. Yet no device of cunning, no band of serpents, can prevail against reason and vigilance. That, Watson, is the only weapon worth mastering. I looked upon him then, his lean figure bathed in the pale light of morning, and felt again the mixture of awe and gratitude I always carried for my friend. He had faced the serpent's hiss and the hunter's aim, and through intellect and courage had triumphed. Whatever shadows yet lingered in London's underworld, I knew they would never go unchallenged while Sherlock Holmes drew breath. And so ended the deadly secret of the Speckled Band, a tale of cruelty and cunning, of serpents and shadows, and of one man's unyielding pursuit of truth in a world too often clouded by fear.